Okay, we're going to start about 1957, 1958, and this is when I was about 8 years old, and I grew up in Heber City. Heber City was really a fun little place to grow up, and we had two movie theaters. One was Avon Theater, and the other one was Ideal Theater, and then there was the Dairy Queen and a few other things up there that was a lot of fun to grow up in Heber City. Well, we had a service station. My grandpa had a service station, and Grandpa Bill Mangum, he went by Bill, but his name was Frank William Mangum. So, but he used to sign all of his papers F.W. Mangum, and I think that is because his grandpa used to sign everything FWC Hathenbruck, so he picked that up when he was young. He was born in 1910, and FWC Hathenbruck died in 1928, so he spent about 18, he was with him about 18 years down in Provo. He lived down in Provo where FWC Hathenbruck spent the last part of his years. So back in the day, he used to tell Bill all these stories about the gold mines that he had in the Uintas. He had gold mines going from Center Creek up to Big Ridge over through Moon Lake area and down through Granddaddy, and just 7 locations for gold mines, and each of these locations might have had 2 or 3 mines in each location. We don't know, but I think what they were Spanish mines, and so he had a mine there in Granddaddy. There was 2 mines that were placer mines, and then he had another mine that had a rich vein in it. And he used to tell me that Hathenbruck had a cabin up there, and he built a cabin, and it had a pine tree growing right out of the top. So we knew that, he told me that this pine tree was still living there when he went up there years ago. So he said that if you went south of the cabin, you would find kind of a cove or a ravine that had a stream running out of it, and it would run all the way down into Rock Creek. And you follow that stream up and go up into that little cove, and you'd go to the base of the mountain, and then you'd climb up about halfway up the mountain and then go to the right, so you're about 2/3 the way around that cove, and there was a small hole that was hidden up in there, and it was a mine, and if you found that hole, you'd climb down into it, and there would be stairs, and it would drop down into a little room. And in that room there used to be some uniforms, he called them, uniforms with brass and buttons and all kinds of stuff up in there in that little room, and I assumed that he kind of implied that they were Spanish armor. And back behind that, I think there was some silver bars that were stacked up in there, and there was a vein in that room that went up there and then protruded into the ceiling, and it went from about 1 foot wide to about 3 foot wide of a gold vein in there, and it was had kind of a rust color brown rock, and then it had black rock, and through that rock was quartz veins, and then it was just loaded with wire gold. And that's what he told me, that one of the rich mines and at Granddaddy was the wire gold mines. Well, that he'd tell me about these stories all the time as I was growing up. And then when I was about 14, 15, 16, right in that area, he came to me one morning and he says, "Randy, I need to tell you something really important." He said that last night I had this vision, or somebody came to him in the night, and it was an Indian, and he was dressed in full white buckskins, pure white, snow white buckskins, and he told my Grandpa Bill that he wasn't supposed to talk about those mines anymore, that he needed to end it because they were dangerous, and you just need to forget about those mines up there. So he told me that he really didn't want me going up into there because it was dangerous. So when I was about 16, I decided I was going to go up in there and look for those mines and look for that cabin and walk in the footsteps where my great-great-grandfather Hathenbruck was. And so my brother and I went up there, and we went up to, well, back when Grandpa went up there, he said you had to start at DeFay's Ranch and climb up over a hog's back, and he called it a hog's back, and it was a real difficult climb, and you had to climb up in there to Splash Dam, and that was about 3-4 miles up into there from the DeFay branch. But when my brother and I went up there, there was a road that went from the DeFay's Ranch all the way to Splash Dam, so we only had about 4.5 miles to hike into Granddaddy, and it wasn't like the old days when he went. So we got up in there, and we hiked up that trail up in the top of the Granddaddy, and we come up over on top of the ridge where you could look down into the basin there, the Granddaddy Basin, and it was just beautiful. You could look at the Granddaddy Lake and Heart Lake and all different little lakes that were kind of poking through the trees. And we looked at each other and we said, how are we going to find a cabin up in all these thick trees? And I said, well, maybe we can go down around that Heart Lake and get up on that side hill of Granddaddy Mountain and climb up there and go along the side of that mountain and look down in and see if we can find anything. I can't think of any other way to just wander around through the trees, and I don't think that'll work out. So we went over on the side of the Granddaddy Mountain and started going across and going through the rocks and going alongside of the mountain, and we're headed south. And we went along and saw a little meadow that was coming up towards the mountain, and we looked down in there and we could see these poles sticking up, and it looked like a mine right in the middle of that little meadow. So we climbed down off the mountain and headed down to those poles there, and when we got closer we could see that it was a mine, and it had like 3 poles sticking up, and it had a pole across and it had a pulley on it, and you could wind up the pulley and pull a bucket up out of that hole. And so that was a mine. We thought, well, that's a mine, and I think I don't know what kind of mine it is, but there's a mine. And we looked over to the west a little bit, and there was a stream coming out of the mountain right there, and it looked like a rusty colored water. It was reddish water, and my grandpa always told me not to drink the water, and I said, I don't think you'd want to drink that water, but he says that water's got mercury in it, and so you can't drink the water. So we wandered down towards the edge of the meadow and where it went into the trees, and that's when we saw the cabin sitting there. And the cabin, as we walked up to it, we could see it had a little pine tree growing out of the top of the cabin. So we knew that we had found the right cabin because it was just exactly the way he explained it. And I don't think the door was even on it anymore. I don't remember a door on it. But I climbed inside that cabin, and the roof was starting to fall down, and back in the back of the cabin was an old pot-bellied stove back in there, a little wood-burning stove. And when I looked around in there, and I couldn't see anything in there other than that stove, and so we come out of there, and I started walking around the cabin looking for things, and I found this old rifle shell, and it was 40. I looked on it, and it was a Winchester 40-82. And I've never heard of a cartridge of 40-82. It must have been an old Winchester rifle, and so I picked that rifle cartridge up and I put it in my pocket. And well, we wandered around looking all around the cabin. We probably went 50 yards in all directions, and it was about 40 feet or so be north of the cabin. There was a old rusty can nailed on the side of a tree there, and I figured when I need to go see what the heck was in that old rusty can, I went over there and pulled out a piece of paper that was folded up inside that can, and it said notice of location. Well, I read on there, and it said notice of location, July 1931. Well, right around 31, 32, 33, the United States made it illegal to own gold, so that pretty well shut down all the mining at that time. So there was that notice for location was probably there since about 1932, and that was about 31, and that was about the end of that. So we decided to head back home, and we started headed towards Granddaddy, and we were following the trail back. And was just as we come around, we come into another little meadow, and in that meadow there was a little stream that ran down it, and we noticed that at the top of the stream there was some sluice boxes there, and there was like 3 sluice boxes and an big old iron pot, probably about 10 inches in diameter, kind of looked like this one right here, but it's called a retort, and what it does is it separates mercury from the gold, and it works like a distillery. You heat it up, and the mercury turns to vapor and goes up through some tubes and pipes, and then you make it come back down, and it turns the mercury from steam or a gas back into a liquid, and you can use it again, and it leaves all the gold in the pot. So if you they had a piece of asbestos paper, there was a whole roll of asbestos paper there, and they'd put the mercury on that asbestos paper and kind of make a little pocket, and then they'd cook that mercury, and then it would leave the gold in the asbestos paper. And so that's how they got the gold out of the mercury. And they'd take that ore and they'd crush it up the best they could, and they'd put it in that sluice box. It had some channels in there with little tubes, and the mercury would filter down through all that ore, and it'd suck all the gold and gather it up in the mercury, and then it would go into that little side trough, and that's where they'd get the mercury and then run it through the retort. So that's the way that worked, and I had to research all that because I didn't know what it was when we first found it, and so we ended up going back down the trail and went back to Heber, and then the next day I took that film that I think they came in a roll of 36. I think that's what film was back then. You had to take it to the drugstore to have it developed, and then you'd wait for about a week, and then you'd go back down and check to see if it was done, and then they'd give you your pictures, and I think they charged more for doubles than they did singles, and I always got the singles. I couldn't afford the doubles. So anyway, after we got the pictures back, I got Mike and we went and talked to Grandpa. We were all excited because we were going to show him pictures of the Hathenbruck cabin. And well, I left out a part. And that's when we went towards Granddaddy, and we're going down at the edge of that little meadow, and we run into a stream that come out of there and run into Lodgepole Lake. And right there by Lodgepole Lake, there was a cabin there on the side of that little stream, and it looked like a newer cabin, and it had a metal roof. And so they had to haul that metal roof all the way up into there and to nail it on that cabin. So there was a cabin at Lodgepole with a metal roof back in those days. I don't know if it's there anymore, but it was back in the 60s. Anyway, we got that film back from the drugstore, and we're all excited, and we took it in there and found Grandpa Bill Mangum and handed him the pictures, and he went through a couple of them real fast and then set them back on the table there, and he says, "Well, you didn't find the cabin." And we were all excited because we thought we did. And I says, "Well, it's got the tree growing out of the top." And he says, "Nope, that's not the cabin." Well, back in about 1971, I didn't know, but Carrie Rossborn and Gail Rhoades come out with a book, and it was called Footprints in the Wilderness, The Lost Rhoades Mine. So that's when we learned that mines were Rhoades mines, and Hathenbruck was a partner. Well, we found out that in 1985, Gail Rhoades and Carrie Rossborn wrote the second edition of the Lost Rhoades Mine, and this is the second edition of the book. And they had got hold of my, we used to call him Uncle Tubby, and he had all of the information about FW Hathenbruck that we didn't even know anything about. So we finally was able to look at it all, and it was kind of interesting that FWC Hathenbruck was a man of many, many talents. He had medical experience. He went up and took care of Chief Tabby when he was sick. He had geology experience. He worked as a topography. He worked on the Soldier Creek Railroad as it come down out of Price area, and he just was an amazing man. And so we found out that he was from royal descent, and later we found out my Aunt Norma had paperwork saying that his father had sent his grandfather had sent a detail over to get him and bring him back to Germany, because he was they wanted him to be the next Kaiser after his dad died in 1988. So they came over in 1988 to bring Hathenbruck back to Germany, and he refused to go. And he said, they told him that if you don't come back with us, well, we're going to erase all your history out of our records, and that's exactly what they did. They erased all of his history out of their records, but all that history was still there, and there was lots of records that we looked up, and we've been finding a lot of history of Hathenbruck from then on. So that's how we got to find out about the royal history, is from Aunt Norma, which she had died back before I found it, and we just was able to run into it. So with this, we're going to end part 2 of the FWC And with this, we're going to end part 2 of the FWC Hathenbruck story.